There's no record. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
Yeah, no, totally. This is really important, good stuff.
Okay, so I'm going to start out then, so after that kind of long-winded intro to this presentation, I'm going to start off by talking about what today's rules are so that we can kind of establish the baseline and then talk about what our new forthcoming rules are. And then, you can kind of get the bigger picture here. So as I mentioned, in 2015, New York City received its first MS4 permit, and that is the state permit that apply, and this is under the Clean Water Act. It applies across the nation. Municipal separate storm sewer systems have to be managed, and stormwater coming from these separately sewered areas of the city needs to be monitored and captured so that we're reducing pollutants into receiving water bodies. And so New York City was one of the last municipalities in the state to get their MS4 permit, and that has to do with the complexity of our system. And so we received it in 2015, and that set the path for creating these new stormwater regulations for the MS4 area. So then it took us 4 years to set those up. And what we did was we created a new stormwater construction permit. We largely just adopted what the state was already doing. And, we had, I think many of you were following along with us as we were standing up our MS4 program. The MS4 permit has like over a dozen permit objectives. The stormwater construction permit is just one of those objectives. So in order to get the permit program into our agency and start implementing the oversight of construction, we just adopted the state's requirements and we rolled that program out. So that, sorry about that. That started July 1st, 2019. And so, again, that permit, and that's still in place right now, it applies to MS4 projects that disturb 1 acre or more of soil. It requires the designers to comply with the New York City Stormwater Design Manual. We have an image of the cover of that manual on the right. And then it requires management, just management of 1.5 inch of rainfall. And so that is in addition to kind of the erosion and sediment control requirements that are, applied to stormwater construction permits. But that's basically the takeaway. And so when you hear us talk about Chapter 19.1 water quality requirements, we're strictly talking about that stormwater construction permit. The second component of today's rules, and this is what I meant when I said we've had stormwater regs on the books since about 2012. This is in regards to the city's site and house connection proposal process. So you often hear us talk about this as the 2012 stormwater rule, but basically what happened back in 2012, we adopted new release rate and volume, so stormwater volume requirements for the allowable flow of on-site stormwater. And these sites, this strictly was applied to the combined sewer system. And the intent there was to maintain more optimal sewer operations, but to also reduce combined sewer overflows. Because what happens in combined sewer areas is that you want to manage that stormwater quantity, so not necessarily quality. So managing the quantity is what helps you reduce peak flow to the wastewater treatment plants and thereby reduce combined sewer overflows at the outfalls. So the new release rates went into place. There was a maximum discharge rate set at 0.25 cubic feet per second. And then all these projects that needed to comply with the 2012 rule followed the guidelines for the design and construction of stormwater management practices. And that's the top manual you see. And when you hear us talk about these requirements, we're talking about Chapter 31 rules. And again, those are for stormwater quantity and flow rates. See if I can get my next slide here. Okay. So that's the overview of today's rules. And then I mentioned, we set off on this path to figure out how to better align our stormwater management practice or our stormwater management regs. And this is kind of a lot of text here, but we had a lot of objectives, so I still think it's kind of important. So what does the Unified Stormwater Rule do? Well, it aligns our Chapter 31 stormwater quantity and flow rate requirements with Chapter 19.1 construction, post-construction water quality requirements. It also extends that program I mentioned we set up in the MS4 areas that we adopted from DEC to combined sewer areas. That authority that we passed to allow us to extend the program to the combined sewer area also allowed us to extend standards and penalties for construction and post-construction control. So now we actually have badges, an enforcement team. We have the authority to regulate stormwater, not just in the MS4 area, but also in the combined sewer area. So that was a really important piece of enabling legislation. We also have updated sewer connection requirements for both combined sewer and MS4 areas. So that's not something that existed before the Unified Stormwater Rule. So we're not just tightening things up in the combined sewer, we're also tightening them up in the MS4 area as well. That I mentioned to you that we started our MS4 program in 2019. Well, we've decided to go further than the state. We have dropped our lot size threshold from 1 acre down to 20,000 square feet of soil disturbance. We've also added the creation of 5,000 square feet or more of new impervious area. So any development project that adds new impervious area in New York City is going to have to comply with our new regulations. That was something that we have really considered, that it was something that we considered for a long time, because that not only adds additional permits and reviews that our staff have to do, but it also kind of extends our authority, and it deviates quite a bit from the state. And we simply did it because we think it's important. Once you're adding that level of impervious area, you are fundamentally changing the way stormwater, the hydraulics and hydrologic cycle on that lot. And so we felt it was important to try to capture those sites. We worked in a way to encourage green infrastructure on sites that are 20,000 square feet or larger. We have created flexibility in our stormwater design manual, and I'm going to go over some of that. And we have also created stormwater management practice hierarchies and selection checklists that are mandatory. And you'll get a glimpse of those in a minute. So a lot of text on this slide too, but specifically what's changing. I kind of went over it already. So now the stormwater construction permit is expanding from MS4 to also be combined sewer. We're dropping our threshold to 20,000 square feet. We're adding the 5,000 square feet or more of new impervious surfaces. We've now created the Unified Stormwater Rules, which you have to meet, and you are managing 1.5 inches of rainfall, but you're doing it with this retention first approach that we're going to talk about. For the site and house connection requirements, we've expanded the restricted flow rates and the increased volumes from the combined sewer to the MS4. So it's kind of like the reverse of what the stormwater construction permit is. Because again, we're looking at this unified citywide approach. And I put the new volume rates in the slide and also the new release rates. And I'm not going to go through those, but they're here if you want to reference them, and they're also on our website. And then the bottom, which is kind of one of our big takeaways, you can now utilize green infrastructure to meet both of your objectives. So both of your permit requirements. This is kind of a repeat of the previous slide, but the one thing I'll add is that in addition to, you know, this additional summary we have here, we've created a new stormwater manual that replaces all the existing stormwater management documents that you may have seen on DEP's website. And that I'm going to cover, and I think it's really kind of the first time we've clearly conveyed what we want to see the public and private development communities do. And so I think that that's one of our big accomplishments here. So one thing, you know, to remember here as we go, you know, maybe I should have started with this slide, but when you think about the stormwater construction permit, it's really trying to accomplish during construction stormwater quality control and post-construction stormwater quality control. So you have a number of different requirements. It's not just build a rain garden to manage your stormwater. It's include erosion and sedimentation controls to minimize the discharge of pollutants during construction activities. That is something that has not been done in New York City. You know, we implemented our program in 2019, but before our program, the state had a program, but the state has an entire state of construction projects to manage. And I think it's fair to say that we probably weren't getting as much oversight here that we needed to stop some stormwater pollution from leaving active construction sites. So now that is in DEP's authority to regulate, and it's very much included here in the stormwater construction permit. There's also the water quality requirements, which I mentioned, you know, were a big focus here. And the intent there is to make sure we're managing runoff from small, frequent storm events that can significantly impact the quality of receiving waters in both MS4 and combined sewer. We have runoff reduction requirements. The easiest way to think about this is that you want to maintain some level of green space on your project, your new development project. There is some that's required in order to maintain a minimum level of runoff reduction during very small storms to preserve the way that lots in the city used to work before they were developed. Then we have no net increase requirements in specific MS4 water sewer sheds, where you have to reduce your pollutants of concern into an MS4 water body that's specifically impaired. And then when we talk about site and house connection proposals, this is really getting at sewer operations. So we want to make sure that the sewers in our city are conveying stormwater and in some cases sanitary, how they're designed, you know, to handle. But when we have increased impervious surfaces and more development, the sewers can become overtaxed with that stormwater. And so when we talk about sewer operations criteria, we're trying to do all we can to make sure that those sewers have the capacity to function as they were designed. And so that's when we get at talking about detaining a certain volume in order to allow the sewers to get what they need to the wastewater treatment plants and be available for the next rain event. So those were the rules. And I know that that was kind of a lot of information and simultaneously a quick overview. But one thing I wanted to mention to this group, because I know that you all talk really closely with the community and you are monitoring, you know, kind of what's happening out there. You're the eyes on the ground. I just want to make sure we're doing a good job conveying what kind of guidance we have out there, because some of the stuff is really technical. But what we've done is we've created a stormwater manual that, like I mentioned, conveys for the first time what we mean when we say build green infrastructure, or, you know, manage your stormwater during your construction project, or, you know, all of these things. So the stormwater manual has 6 chapters. Quick introduction. It then has a very detailed chapter on the stormwater management requirements for both chapters. So for the stormwater construction permit, and then for the site and house connection proposal. It has the city development and review requirements. That's basically the process, like the workflow. So how an applicant is going to submit their project to DEP for review, and then how they're going to get their permits. Chapter 4 is the heart of the manual. This is the stormwater management practice selection and design chapter. I'm going to go over just a couple slides on what's in that chapter, but it's what took us the longest. And I will say, we looked at all the major cities, what kind of stormwater rules, and most specifically, what kind of manuals they had to communicate their rules. And we modeled ours after the city of Los Angeles, and they had a really great kind of visual approach to showing the development community what kind of stormwater performance we're looking for, and then letting them have the maximum design flexibility in getting there. And so this is really what took us the longest time to develop the manual. But it was also kind of like the funnest, because as many of you know, and maybe I should have explained who I am a little bit more, but I work with the New York City Green Infrastructure Program, and we started our program in 2011, and we've constructed over 11,000 green infrastructure practices across the city. And what we've done now is kind of shared some of those lessons learned. We've said, yes, our stormwater rules were a long time coming. Maybe we should have started like Philadelphia did and implemented these 20 years ago. But there was a lot of skepticism at how green infrastructure could be constructed and how it would actually work in an ultra urban city like New York. We're not like Philadelphia. We're very, very urban. And so we did it, and we're still doing it. And so we've shown people how to build it. We've built over 11,000 practices. We have another 10,000 practices coming. And so we wanted to make sure that we could demonstrate to the design community, to the developers, we've been doing it with public funding for 10 years. You can do it too. And here's all the lessons. Here are all of our secrets. And so they're all here in chapter 4. And it's my favorite part of the manual, and I'm very excited about it. So then chapter 5 is the post-construction stormwater management requirements. The really interesting and neat thing about chapter 19.1 is that every single practice that gets constructed has to have a maintenance permit. And the developers have to certify that their assets, their practices are functioning yearly, and every 5 years, they have to recertify and basically say, this, I've had an engineer come out and assess the health of my stormwater management practice, and it is indeed working. They stamp it, they sign it, and they submit it. And so there's a lot of oversight here. We're not just asking people to build things and walk away. We're requiring them to build them, and then we're requiring them to demonstrate that they're working. Finally, we created a standalone chapter for what you're required to do in the right of way, because there were a lot of questions from the developing, mostly public agencies and utilities like Con Edison and Verizon and National Grid. Everybody was like, how do these apply to us? And it is very nuanced. So we created a standalone chapter for them. So I mentioned that chapter 4 is the heart of the manual and my favorite part of the manual. And so quick couple slides on what we did here. We created a function first framework for stormwater management practices. You're probably familiar with these terms, but I'll go through them really quickly. When we talk about infiltration, we mean water is captured and infiltrated into the underlying soils. You have to have good permeability rates for this. The classic example of an infiltration practice is the rain gardens that we DEP construct in the streets and sidewalks. Those do not have under drains. They are pure retention infiltration practices, meaning stormwater enters them, infiltrates into the soils, and then what bypasses goes out the outlet. Filtration practices. This is a very common in MS4 areas. You have stormwater going through a filtration media device and it removes pollutants. It typically has an under drain or an outlet pipe. And the classic example here is a sand filter. Then we have evapotranspiration practices. This is where water is captured into the practice, but parts of it are leaving the practice through evapotranspiration back into the atmosphere. This relies on evapotranspiration happening between rainfall events. If it doesn't happen, the practice is full and it can't accept the next rain event. So it's very important that it's designed to evapotranspirate and that is credited appropriately. So the classic example here is a green roof. Then we have detention systems. These are pretty simple. Stormwater is temporarily slowed and then it's released at a lower flow rate. A detention tank is a good example. Then we have water reuse. This is for stormwater that's captured and reused for non-irrigation purposes. If you want to get credit for a reuse system as a stormwater management practice in our manual, it has to have continuous reuse of water. And that is so that we can be 100% confident that that reuse system is going to be empty when the next rain event happens. And that has to be demonstrated as part of the submittal. So it's really important that it is a continuous use. It's a closed system. It's something that we can take someone's word for that it's going to be ready for the next rain event. And then we've done a couple of these through our grant program, but reuse in a cooling tower is a classic example there. So the benefits of this function first framework are pretty cool. So what happens is a designer can choose one of many practices and then tweak it slightly to meet one of those functions. So on the right, I have a stormwater planter box designed as an infiltration practice, and then right below that designed as a filtration practice. So the biggest difference is the infiltration stormwater planter box does not have an outlet pipe, but the one below it has an outlet pipe. And what this means, we get people all the time that were like, I can't do rain gardens because I don't have good soils. And we're like, yes, you can. All you have to do is do this outlet pipe. So we're showing people, we really want you to do vegetated practices. They are extremely important to us. And so no longer can we accept simple, I don't have the soils. They have to say, I don't have the soils. I don't have the space. You know, there has to be a number of reasons for it to be acceptable. And so your drainage media changes a little bit. You're going to have a deeper subgrade. If you're using infiltration as your function, you may have a different planting plan. And you may have, you know, a little bit different drainage depths for your drainage media. But for the most part, you know, we demonstrated in chapter 4 how you can do many of these preferred typologies with several siting constraints. And so you'll see in the manual, and specifically in chapter 4, that a lot of our guidance is specified by function type. So the hierarchy changes based on how your practice functions, your sizing criteria, the design criteria, and then the various components. And again, we really did this to maximize flexibility, but to also convey, you know, what we want and get the practices we want. So what was important in doing that was creating mandatory hierarchies for stormwater management practice implementation. There's one for MS4, which is the one I have on the slide right now. And then there's another one for combined sewer areas. So I mentioned in MS4 areas, we're looking at water quality treatment because that stormwater is discharging directly to a receiving water body. So what we want to do is treat it. Well, what we want to do is remove it entirely. But if we can't do that, then we want to treat it. So you'll see that our primary goal is retention. And when we say retention, we're saying keep it out of our stormwater system entirely, keep it on your property. And then the secondary goal is vegetation. So you read the hierarchy from the dark boxes to the light and from left to right, top to bottom. So first and foremost, vegetated retention. Give us a rain garden with no outlet pipe, infiltrate all the stormwater you can, or use one of these other practices. And then when you get to the bottom, you can get to non-vegetated treatment, but you have to demonstrate how you're moving down and across the hierarchy, and you have to show us your constraints. So the bottom of the hierarchy in the MS4 area is going to have treatment practices like porous pavements, and synthetic turf fields and sand filters. That's probably what we would see most of here in the city. And then you would use our function first framework to design it so that you have an outlet pipe that's going to give you some sort of, probably some sort of release back to the sewer system, but not until that stormwater goes through some drainage media to clean it up. And so then you'll notice that reuse is in this orange box off to the right, and it's anytime optional. And that's because we consider stormwater reuse, if it's designed like how I mentioned in the previous slide, to be retention. It's completely removed from our stormwater, our sewer system. And so if you can do it, you can do it anytime. You can even do it over vegetated retention, because it's that good for our system, and it's a good practice to have. And we're going to see a lot more of that in New York City, similar to what other cities experience for reuse. So the combined sewer area hierarchy is pretty close. Same primary goal, same secondary goal, retention first, vegetation second, reuse is anytime optional, hanging out over there in the orange box. The practices are pretty much the same. What happens though is when you get to the bottom of the combined sewer area hierarchy, you see detention practices. So you see non-vegetated detention, and that's in New York City, it's probably going to be a lot of subsurface systems or blue roofs or detention tanks. And so that again, you have to demonstrate if you end up in that last tier, tier 3, you have to show us and you have to document your constraints and prove them.
And Melissa, could you go back to the previous slide just to toggle between MS4 and CS?
Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so you'll see a lot
So
of
just reiterate that distinction between retention
Sure.
between them. Thanks.
That's right. Yeah, you'll see the top tier is going to be vegetated retention in both. The real difference comes at the bottom tier, tier 3, the bottom right box. It's non-vegetated treatment here. So these are practices where you're going to have an outlet pipe, and you're not going to have a surface expression, or if you do, it's like porous concrete, and you're going to have some, under porous concrete, you get a drainage course. So you have crushed stone and some sand potentially, and then you'll have the stormwater is going to go through that and reduce, it's going to clean up some of the pollutants in the stormwater, and then it's going to have an outlet pipe back to the sewer system. And then in the bottom right on the combined sewer hierarchy, it's non-vegetated detention. So the difference there being, we care about quantity of water in combined sewers. We care about quality, but it's going to the treatment plant. It's going to get treated unless it overflows. So what we want to do is restrict the release rate so that we're reducing the amount of overflows that happen at the outfall, which is what leads to water quality impairments in combined sewer areas. So restricting that quantity, and we're restricting it much more significantly under the unified stormwater rule than we are today. It's going to reduce combined sewer overflows quite a bit. It's like, if I have the numbers right, the practices are over 8 times more efficient in CSO volume reduction than they are today.
Wow. So you're not aiming for treatment, on-site treatment in the combined sewer system as much as you are in the MS4 systems. That's
right. But if you think about it, the top box in both is retention, and that is treatment. That is
treatment. Yes. Yeah.
That's entirely removing the stormwater from our sewer system, because it's keeping it on the site as much as possible. I think, a lot of private properties are going to be constrained and they're going to have some overflow. But retention practices where you're able to size the practice to retain the entire water quality volume, the 1.5 inches, it's going to be very effective for both on-site treatment and also just CSO reduction.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Great.
Okay, big checklist here, but this is our constraints checklist. So when you're looking at this, we have the tiers. So we have let me start with practice type. We have all the practice types that you saw in our hierarchies listed. We have their functional categories, and then we have what tier they fall in. And then we have the list of allowable constraints. So you'll see that our most preferred practice is tier 1. It's infiltration, it's bioretention. There are a lot of potential constraints that you could have on a site where you can't get this, and we're acknowledging that. At the same time, you have to prove it because, like I mentioned, we've done them and we know they can be done in New York City and we want to see them. So we've defined the soil constraints, or, the various constraints up front and made it clear that you have to meet these in order to make the case that you can't implement bioretention. So the soil constraints are, you have permeability rates of less than 0.5 inches per hour. Subsurface constraints would be you've done your geotechnical investigation and you have high groundwater or high bedrock. Hotspot constraints means that you have some sort of land use or existing soil conditions that if you start to infiltrate stormwater into, you could be moving around soil or groundwater contamination. So there's very specific requirements for demonstrating that, because we do allow lined practices. So you have to demonstrate that neither of those would work, and then submit that documentation. And then there's potential surface constraints. So you could have regulation like minimum parking requirements that might limit you from implementing a rain garden in a parking lot. You could also have some egress requirements that don't let you put a rain garden near a parking lot exit. And then there are potential space constraints. So infiltration practices do have required setbacks from a lot of things. And that's what makes kind of implementing rain gardens in New York City kind of difficult. So you have setback requirements from underground utilities, property lines, existing trees, other site features. But we included all of our lessons learned in the manual, which kind of pulls together all the code requirements for where you can and can't cite infiltration practices. And so I think that's going to be a good resource for people. But basically, the takeaway here is that, we know that there are going to be some sites that can't implement rain gardens. It's our primary objective. We want to see surface level green. We want to green the city. We also know from experience that that's the best way to manage stormwater. It's kind of reverting our city back to pre-development conditions, letting green space, be on a site level, at the ground level of a new development is really, really important to us. At the same time, we know not everybody's going to be able to do it. So at a minimum, everyone's going to have to do a green roof, because look here, the green roof line, it's also in tier 1. There are none. You don't need, you don't have existing soil. You don't have subsurface constraints. You don't have hotspots. You probably have some surface, but we're going to ask people to try really hard to minimize their surface constraints. So if it's rooftop equipment or whatever it is, maybe they can just go around it. And then space. I mean, it's going to be hard for people because they're not going to be able to put as much amenity space, or they're going to have to try to integrate their green roof in. But we really, really, really want to see green roofs at a minimum. Again, we want to see site level green infrastructure, but if we can't get that, we have to have a green roof.
New construction over 20,000 square feet requires a green roof, basically. That's your default, the one that has no carve-outs.
Yeah. And unless they're building like a school on top of the roof, we've seen that in Long Island City. There, there's a project where part of their rooftop is repurposed for a schoolyard. And so we can't really say you can't have your school, you have to use that whole space for a green roof, because I think it's something, yeah, that there are going to be challenges maybe like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, we expect green roofs.
Excellent.
There's going to be a lot of constrained lots where they can't do a rain garden at the ground, but they
It's,
have a whole rooftop.
I'm thinking because of ZQA, there is more building up front to the sidewalk, and there's less parking requirements with ZQA too. So you're going to have to put it somewhere.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll go over. I have a question about DCP later. We'll get back into ZQA.
Okay, so I just have 4 more slides here. This slide is sort of summing, this is one of my favorite parts of the manual. When we implemented the green infrastructure program, there were a lot of things we didn't know, and we relied kind of heavily on the New York City design and engineering community to kind of lead the way for helping determine how to set up your practices, and like how to create certainty. So how do I go into sizing a rain garden to manage 1.5 inches of rainfall? Well, so we've had a lot of contracts. We retrofit schools and parks. We've retrofitted over 100 properties. We have 300 more in our pipeline. And so this is something we know now, and we've laid out all the formulas that we use in the GI program. How do you size your stormwater management practices? And one thing we've done here to create certainty and to also allow for the crediting of green infrastructure towards both of the stormwater regulations, the chapter 19.1 and the chapter 31, is we've laid all this out. So in general, the stormwater management practices need to be sized to store the entire water quality volume within the drainage media. And then from there, you can try to figure out, or you will figure out using the manual, which of your other requirements apply and what kind of credit you can get by using that practice towards your other requirements. So the Unified Stormwater Rule allows you to implement one stormwater management practice to meet up to 3 requirements or a portion of 3 requirements. So for example, in this table to the right, which is, I will say, something the development community, when they heard we were working on these rules, they said, tell us how to do more with less and give us the credits, right? Because in today's world, not many people are getting credits for their green roofs towards their detention requirements. And that's been something that's been communicated a lot. And so they're ending up, the way it works is that you may just end up implementing a green roof because you like the way it looks, but you're not necessarily getting that stormwater credit towards the sizing of your detention tank. And we knew that was a problem, but when we implemented the 2012 rule, we also didn't know the performance of some of these systems like we do now. So now we're saying, implement your green roof. You're also going to get credit towards your detention requirements, and we've laid that out. So the first line here is an infiltration stormwater management practice. If you are able to implement one, you get 100% credit towards your water quality volume requirement. You get 100% credit towards that runoff reduction requirement, which is what's trying to help restore the city back to its natural hydrologic cycle. And then you get 50% towards your detention, your sewer operations criteria, which is pretty huge. And today you can maybe demonstrate a very minor credit, but you're not getting much. So you can reduce the volume you need for detention by 50% if you're able to implement an infiltration practice. So we're really trying to incentivize that and get people to do this because it's really, it's really important for us. And we want to make sure people are seeing these practices as real stormwater management practices instead of just redundancy.
Instead of just an amenity.
Instead of an amenity. Yeah. I mean, it's
Yeah.
it's actually operating and performing as infrastructure. And so
Sure.
we
Yeah.
wanted to make it clear. Okay, so last thing on the manual, we have a ton of guidance in our appendices. So the chapters alone are great, but then we have all these other things. Obviously, we have the hierarchy checklist I just showed you. We have a no net increase calculator, and then in the appendix, we have a guide to using the calculator. We have citing criteria that I mentioned is sort of the lessons learned we pulled together through the GI program. We have sizing examples where we've done the formula. We've like hand calculated a number of different stormwater management practices and sized them out for developers and designers. Same with the site design example. We've gone through a couple scenarios like start to finish to say this is what you would do. We created a new controlled flow pump workbook. And so this is for sites that need to implement some sort of pumping system with their detention. And this happens in sort of in like Manhattan and maybe even in the Bronx too, where you have to go pretty deep to get your detention system in place for your type of like high density development. And then you need to implement a pump to pump the stormwater up, to meet the sewers. And so this is something the design community asked for right when we started this work. And we were like, I think we can do this. And so we were able to make that. We also did a detention in series workbook. It helps designers figure out how to size their SMPs when they have more than one. And it's called the detention in series workbook, but it's kind of cool because you can plug in a non-detention practice and it's going to tell you how it relates to potentially a second SMP that you need to implement, and then what your credit would be for your, for implementing two practices. So it's kind of a cool plug and play thing. And then we have some right-of-way guidance materials. I mentioned that we created a standalone right-of-way chapter, and everybody was like, you have so many things you've learned in the right-of-way. Can you share that? So we've just given everybody our geotechnical procedures document, which lays out exactly how you should be doing the soil borings and the laboratory analysis to determine if you can infiltrate. And it's really just sort of like all of our secrets on right-of-way GI, which not secrets, but it's good info for people. So then this should be my last slide here. You might be wondering, when will the rules be in place? Well, we just finished up, we did two big public informational briefings. I know Karen was at one of them at least. And then we had our public hearing last Monday, and I also saw Karen there virtually. And we received, I don't know, maybe less than 100 comments, but some were quite detailed. So yeah, maybe between like 75 and 100 comments. We're taking those and turning them into we're calling it a technical FAQ. There's some other kind of like applicability stuff, but I think it's going to be really helpful because it is interesting. Some of the questions we got were like the same. And so we, made a few changes to the manual, no changes to the rule, but a few changes to the manual to make a couple things more clear. And then we just said, well, let's share all these questions with everybody and how we're responding. So that I hope is up on our website by the end of the week. And it's sort of just like, like when will the rules apply? How does it apply to this project? How do you calculate evapotranspiration for green roofs? Like that kind of stuff. And so I think it'll be just good guidance for everybody to look at. So that should be on the website by the end of the week. And then I think our rules are supposed to go to the public record this week, which means they'll be published next week as final, and they'll be in effect sometime in February.
Wow.
I know. we somehow, we were way behind schedule, and then we were thinking we wouldn't have these in place until June.
Yeah.
And then we sort of caught up. And so now here we are.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, Melissa, so I'm just going to ask some procedural questions. You answer the last one and then turn it over to the committee members and then open it to the public. And we're looking at about 15 minutes of discussion for this, everybody. So you've answered the question about when these will be approved and who approves that actually? What is the entity that approves the rules? Is it in the administrative code? What is the approval process for this?
That's a good question. So if you remember, we needed legislation. My pandemic timeline is all messed up. That was August of 2020 when City Council introduced the legislation we needed to expand our stormwater construction permitting program.
Okay.
That was 2020. So City Council needed to do that and vote
They
on it, which they
enjoined you.
did.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, and then that let us start working on the rules. Now we're officially in the Citywide Administrative Procedure Act.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, so now we're kind of following that process. So we don't, now we just publish. I
Now you're
think.
promulgating rules. Yes, I understand.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Will DEP be the examiners for all of the rules, or will you be engaging DOB for any reason or for
Yeah,
any purpose?
That's a good question. Most projects. Well, okay, it depends. So for the site connection proposals, the chapter 31 parts of the rule,
Yeah.
DOB is the entity that determines if a site or house connection proposal applies.
Okay.
So it goes to them first and it comes to us.
Okay.
And then we do the plan review and we do the proposal certification. And then for the stormwater construction permit, DOB, they should come to us relatively early. And DOB is also flagging any projects that meet like our threshold, our soil disturbance or our new impervious area threshold. And then we, we'll be finding projects on our own as well. But in theory, if someone doesn't come to us, they'll get flagged by DOB. And so we also do all of the plan review and permitting for that.
Okay, that's good. Have you received any complaints or questions about whether you are imitating or conflicting with state SWIP requirements? DEC SWIP. Do people feel like those are two redundant requirements?
Well,
do they follow each other very closely?
Well, that's a really good question. We've taken over for DEC in New York City. So, I think there's some, I guess there's
some. You are the new DEC.
What's that?
You are the new DEC within the municipal framework.
I mean, I guess
that's pretty cool.
Yeah, applicants still, because there's a state construction general permit, CGP, there's still notification requirements to DEC.
Yeah.
And so if you're in the MS4 and you trigger the CGP, you're still notifying the state. But that's right. Our stormwater construction permitting program does that review for DEC now. We've taken that permitting program over.
Okay. All right.
So I don't think people have said we're redundant. I do think there are a lot of people still trying to figure out where we deviate.
Mm-hmm.
And we are required to be at least as stringent as the state. We can be more stringent if it's justified. And I mentioned we have a few areas where we are more stringent because we feel it's justified in our city. But at a minimum, we have to be as stringent as the state.
Interesting. Okay, excellent. Well, Melissa, I'm going to open up to our committee. And I know that all of you are thinking about how to visualize this actually happening with buildings and especially in our vulnerable flood prone area. So are there questions from members of the E&S committee? And please raise your hand. Karen, go ahead, please.
Yeah, hi, Melissa. My question is, does this apply to redevelopment projects like brownfield cleanups and stuff like that?
Potentially, yeah, if they're disturbing, if they meet the soil disturbance threshold, yeah, they will. A lot of times there are some activities that these cleanup properties might do that's
Okay, Sadie.
redevelopment.
Well, I'm not. It's
Um,
just Hudson.
Just gonna have to mute yourself for a second. We're in the weeds here. Thank you.
And so, so yeah, it's possible they might be doing some activities that won't trigger the threshold, but if and when it gets redeveloped, it probably would, yeah, disturb the soil threshold.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Are there other questions from the committee? Now, questions from the community that's joined us today. And I hope all of you who have paid attention to flooding in the area and also questionable construction projects and rocky outcroppings in Snat area will recognize that this is a game changer for how we manage water. Almost everyone has not only seen construction projects become water slides, so the stormwater prevention permit will interest you, but also just the way we build things with impervious surfaces in valleys and hills that promote the flow of water. This is really made for our district, and that's really why I was so eager to have you come, Melissa, because we just have been, along with Queens, an epicenter of flooding and storm impacts in the last 2 years. Are there any other questions? Yes, go ahead, Deb. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess just in terms of thinking about implementation, I mean, this is really wonderful and very thorough when it comes to designing and building new buildings, developing land. But a lot of our district is already developed. So how does this fit in with kind of, is it with like, retrofitting and existing structures?
That's a really good point. This certainly is one tool we have to catch new and redevelopment and make it better for stormwater, but it leaves an entire population out. And I talked to Karen about this a lot. Right now, stormwater retrofits are voluntary right now. We have some resources. We have a new private incentive program that private property owners that are very large, have large, greater than 50,000 square feet or more of impervious area, and have some opportunity to implement stormwater management practices can take advantage of. So we try to incentivize that where we can. We also have a green roof grant program that only funds green roof retrofits. But that's about it. I think right now the only tool we have for retrofits is information and incentives, and just encouraging people to know what's happening with their stormwater and how it may be impacting the neighboring community. So yeah, I know that's not.
Yeah.
Just one quick follow-up question. I know you talked about that there would be a process for a building once it put a maintenance plan in place that every 5 years would have to renew. One of the things I see a lot is that over time, people pave and put concrete down for all sorts of uses, and including just not wanting to care for lawns and parking and all that stuff. That's not part of the maintenance plan per se. Like, how is there any inspection or enforcement planned for that kind of slow creeping permeable surface?
That is a really good question. And I've also talked to Karen about this at great lengths. Many of us at DEP have. And you know, I live in Queens in Astoria, and this is something that is really, it's really happening here as well. We have a lot of new off-street parking showing up all the time, you know, and it's really just a
That's
side
it.
yard that somebody paved over and now they're parking their car on, and they have an illegal curb cut and it's not allowed. And every time I see one,
Sadie?
I try to, you know, report it to DOB. You can report code
Come on,
issues, and it, you know, that's what they are, code violations. Illegal driveways is like one of them that's easily identified in 311. And that, you know, it's an enforcement problem. I think it's really difficult for DOB to have like the boots on the ground to catch all of these, this creep that you know, the slow creep of new impervious surfaces popping up everywhere. And again, that's one of the reasons why we added the 5,000 square feet as a trigger, because we see it too. And we've heard this complaint over and over again, and we want to be able to do something about it too. A lot of times, you know, I'm not sure what percentage of them are going to meet that 5,000 square feet. There's a lot of small ones I see in my neighborhood. That's definitely something we're looking for, why we added the 5,000 square feet. Because it does impact the way stormwater is being managed, you know, in our neighborhoods. So it is really a problem, but I also think it's an enforcement problem. And I've seen little pieces of legislation like drafted and coming around, floating around every now and then to try to like get at this issue. But I'm not certain what it would take, other than we would have to have some serious enforcement resources to handle something like that.
And then my last question is just simply, how would a building know how efficient they are? Like if you're an existing building, you know, I live in a 14-story building that has lawns and connections to the sewer. Like how would a building that wanted to behave responsibly or to work in thinking about climate change, how would they measure these things?
That's a really good question. I think there's little things, you know, like buildings maintenance staff can do. You can try to monitor ponding. And if you're seeing excessive ponding for small frequent events, which are the ones that really impact water quality, you can do CCTV inspections of your on-site drainage systems. You can make sure your inlets, if you have yard drains, the drain covers are clear. You can, you know, you can consider if you do have lawn space, you could consider downspout roof leader disconnections. You know, if you see any sort of like backup, stormwater backup, it's kind of hard to tell sometimes if it's stormwater related. And then just, you can do everything you can think of to make the site, you know, less, you know, more pervious. Maintaining lawn space, implementing green roofs, using rain barrels. Just keeping an eye out too where your roof leaders are. Sometimes I see some illegal disconnections where the roof leaders are just kind of hanging out on the sidewalk, and you know, that is always something that's kind of hard to see.
I have another question from David and Deidre, and then I will have a last question, and then we'll close this out. So thank you, David. Go ahead.
Well, I think Deirdre was up next.
I'll take you first. You're a community board member, and then Deidre.
Okay.
David. Go ahead.
Okay, very simply, I'm sure your neighbors are frustrated like so many other New Yorkers about parking. So that's why they decide they don't need their side yard and they'll pave it. So my question is it a matter of education? In other words, can I put in parking in my side yard as long as it's permeable?
Well, there's a side yard text amendment that was implemented, back when the green code was done, maybe 2010. I don't think it so I think it depends on your zoning, your specific zoning, and then how that side yard amendment affected the various zoning districts. It's my understanding, I don't think even permeable surfaces were allowed, but I'd have to go back and check.
And the same would be true for the front yard.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, if you're gonna do it, permeable surfaces are definitely, a way to help. And there's ways to do them where you are, maximizing the amount of stormwater that can be infiltrated. And we use at DEP, we've retrofitted a lot of parking lots with permeable surfaces. So it's definitely an effective tool. It is sort of hard to kind of think about areas of the city that, there's the started green, and then we're losing the limited amount of green space that we have. But I certainly understand the parking problems as well. So it's
Melissa,
definitely balanced.
let's remember to follow up on the larger parking lots and the opportunities in a separate conversation. We'll go offline for that because this area does have parking lots for institutions and large apartment buildings, which I think really would benefit. We have gone through some terrible storms and runoff and sewer backups because of supercharged sewers. Deidre, and then user 2, I'm sorry for not noticing you before. And Deidre, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I think I've unmuted myself.
Go ahead.
A couple of questions. Sites that are currently being built on, are they required to submit these plans and participate in the program to manage their
Great
stormwater?
question. Yeah, we have a site up on Upper Broadway, which everyone is concerned here, a huge site that is in a vulnerable area. Thanks, Deidre, for that. Great question.
The other thing is, does this conflict with ZQA? Because my understanding is ZQA allowed developers to build out to the property line and to cover up and make more space impermeable.
Correct. More density. Yep.
Karen,
Those are great questions.
On Bailey Avenue, not Bailey, yeah, I guess it's Bailey, right next to Fordham Hill. You're building on a really strange lot, and it looks like they're going right out to the property lines, and that will create a huge water problem. That's what made me think of that question. Last kind of questions or thoughts. If developers and builders have to self-certify, who makes sure that they are playing by the rules? And what are there penalties? You have lots of carrots, which I think are wonderful, but are there penalties for those people who choose not to take care of our stormwater?
Thank you. Go ahead, Melissa.
Awesome questions. Sites that are currently in construction have to comply with today's rules. And today's rules are, if you're disturbing greater than 1 acre, you have to submit the stormwater construction permit to DEP. And then if you trigger a site connection, which I'm guessing that one does, you have to comply with the 2012 stormwater rule. So yeah, there are existing regulations that I covered, I think in like slide.
I saw that.
Yeah, so those sites, those are in place today. So the new requirements, they do not have to comply with those. If they've already started construction, they're past the point.
Do you anticipate that shovel in the ground problem where people will start working on a site so they don't have to conform?
Yes. I mean, that's what happened when we took the permit from DEC in 2019, when we started implementing that program. We didn't get any applications for a few months because everybody had gone to DEC before the effective date of our permit, because they knew, well, I think they just figured it would be easier to work with DEC than us. And so, yeah, I know a lot of people rushed their projects to avoid this program for sure.
So
There's
Melissa, when,
also-
yeah, when you distribute your memorandum to agencies that say these rules are now in effect,
Yeah.
what will you say to DOB about the stage of application that they have? Is it for all new applications or applications that are currently under review or applications that are approved but yet not yet permitted? Have you thought about when you're going to capture a permitted and applications for building with the new rule?
Yeah, I mean, that DOB is sort of like one thing. If they don't have an approved application from DEP, when the stormwater rules go into effect, they have to comply.
Okay.
So there's a lot of people that have submitted their paperwork, they go into the DOB now system and they're sort of showing some permit activity, and there's a ton of permits that I'm not even familiar with, but they may not even have come to DEP yet. And so if they don't have a shovel in the ground in like 2 or 3 weeks, when our rules go into effect, they have to comply.
Okay.
Regardless of where they are with DOB.
That's good to know.
I want to make sure I'm saying that right. Yeah, I mean, ours is shovel in the ground. The site connection proposals are a little different because you need to have a DEP site connection proposal before you can get your foundation permit.
Sure.
So there are some instances where people have already received approval for their site connection proposals under Chapter 31. And the rules are going to go in effect in February, but they haven't started construction. So they'll probably be allowed to implement with their approved site connection proposal, but then they're going to get picked up under the new stormwater construction permit. So we won't make them redesign their site connection proposals, but they would get picked up for the stormwater construction permit. There's no way, there's nothing we can do about that. Yeah.
Our last question from someone named.
Oh, I'm sorry. There was one more question.
Yeah.
From,
About ZQA.
Enforcement and penalties.
oh, enforcement and penalties. Yes, we have enforcement ability and we have a penalty schedule. I don't have the penalties off the top of my head, but we had to pass a penalty schedule with our stormwater regs. And then the zoning allowances, unfortunately, zoning allowances, they stand. So if someone has the legal right to build a lot line to lot line building, and that's what they're doing, we can't require them to keep a front yard for stormwater management. So that's the problem, but that's why we're going to go really hard on green roofs.
Thank you.
And one last question from someone named user 2. You could just identify yourself, please.
User 2, Marie Claude, local resident, Bailey
Hello.
Avenue.
Hello, Mary Claude.
Hello. It's related to Deidre's comments. There is that new school planned for Van Cortlandt Park South. Would this mean it would have a green roof? That's the first question. The second is the land committee was examining the case of a new construction on Orloff and Cannon, and the building would extend to the limit of the sidewalk, would have no frontage. And members were minded that. So it would have to be a piece of land, at least 1 acre, for the board to maybe object to the fact that this building has no yard in front of it. It would be built at a place where Cannon turns into Orloff. Wonderful, on a slope. So that would be my second question. So if that piece of land is less than 1 acre, it can do what it wants. So first is the school, second is this Orloff being looked at by the land committee. And my last comment is Kingsbridge Heights as well as Riverdale is filled with wonderful staircases that connect streets. But they have generally, at least on this side, nothing green on the side. They're like waterfalls, no trees, nothing on the side of the steps. So just for the community board, it would be wonderful that when these steps are redone, that they could be more green. And that's it.
Thank you, Marie Claire. So a question about a school first, Melissa.
Yeah, and public projects are subject to the new rules in the same way that private are. So I think this is a brand new school that's in like concept phase right now, it sounds like maybe, or.
Yes.
Yeah, they
yes.
have not received approval from School Construction Authority yet to build. They're just proposing.
Right, yeah, they'll be subject to the stormwater rules in the same exact way. School Construction Authority definitely has hesitations about green roofs. They have a lot of pressure to do solar for, you know, the various energy reduction and strategy goals. So they have a lot of pressure there to do solar, and I think they have some concerns with green roofs and maintenance. It's definitely worth, you know, you having early conversations with them on that design, but they will have to implement stormwater management practices. We see them do a lot of permeable pavements and some tree plantings and some bioretention, not a lot of green roofs.
Okay.
And then the site, I think you said there's currently a site that's in development right now.
Not yet. I guess they're talking to the community board. The building they propose will have 0 space on Orloff, whereas the zoning requires to be set back a little bit.
Oh, the zoning requires setback, but they're choosing not to?
Well, I don't know, but well, that's why I guess they're presenting their plans to the community board 8. If any one of you was on the land committee talk about this, yes, they haven't started construction at all, but they have the plan. And that's what they showed. Yeah.
You might want to mention our stormwater rules to them.
We'll take care of that. Don't worry. Then this
yeah,
will
you
be
can
shared,
kindly send them the
and-
link.
definitely.
I mean that, yeah, and that does sound like an opportunity. If
Melissa,
they're,
I think a lot of community board land use committees and will need a kind of check sheet on what they're looking at, because going to the sidewalk and then being told that we can't do anything with retention, and so therefore you know, we're excluded. A lot of this we really need a lot of high level of engagement with this, because we see quite a bit, but you know, it also is not approved yet. I'll look into that, ma'am, in the office about the Orloff, and find out at what stage that is. So with that, I'd really like to thank Melissa Enoch for an incredibly in-depth discussion. I don't know how many community boards you've actually gone out to. I know you've given citywide briefings. This has been on that level, and I just want to thank you. We are a land use driven entity, as you know, and our land use committee is really so important. And these really do impact decisions. Also, everyone who's faced the storms that we have recently wonder about what DEP can do to increase sewer capacity. And I think you've given us really an answer here, is that we have to turn our building practices into water management systems more effectively, and use every square foot we have, rather than always going underground and tearing up sewer pipes. So this is really a wake-up call, Melissa. I want to thank you for the comprehensive look in the details. And of course, if we can have the PowerPoint, if you could mute yourself, ma'am, we will be able to share and field more questions for you. And we can't wait for the announcement of the rules. And thank you so much for your generosity with your time and your expertise. But if you could just make me host again or relieve yourself of host because I have to share a screen again. There you go. Okay. Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you so much. Thank you all very much.
Give
Appreciate
everyone
it.
a hand
Really
for
good
Melissa.
questions. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, we have a presentation from an important energy company that's doing work in our area throughout New York State. It's a new addition to our agenda. The CEO of TDI is with us today to talk about renewable energy in our area. We also are well prepared to talk about odor complaints with coming downwind from the Yonkers filtration plant, a pollution control plant in Ludlow, and the committee has some budget and planning priorities to look at. So if we could hold on, I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Donald Jessom. Don, could you just unmute yourself? And if he's not, we can come back. There you go, Don. So you came into a meeting on a really historic change in our building process here in New York City. And Mr. Jessom is here to talk about historic change in our energy generation policy for New York State. Don, would you like to share a screen or would you rather just talk about it?
Yeah, I have a presentation, so if I could share the screen, that would be very helpful.
Sure. Okay, just a minute. So you could just introduce yourself. And hold on, not me. Sorry, I have to make you host. Okay.
Co-host, you make him co-host.
Okay. Share screen. Okay. I think you can share right now. Try it, Don.
All right.
Okay, there you go.
All right. Does everyone see my screen?
We do.
All right. Thank you so much. Well, I certainly appreciate the opportunity this evening to talk to Community Board 8 about our project, the Champlain Hudson Power Express project. I'm joined by several colleagues who are also on the line, and we're here to give you an overview of our project, how it's going to impact the city in a very positive way, and here to answer questions. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak this evening. So let me tell you a little bit about the Champlain Hudson Power Express project. The project itself, as you can see on the map on the left-hand side, it's going to be going from the border up by Rouse's Point, right at the border between Quebec and New York, come down Lake Champlain. So this is 2 cables about the size of my fist that will be carrying this clean energy from Quebec. So we'll be bringing hydropower from Quebec on this transmission line. So the CHPE project is the actual transmission line itself. We come down about 100 miles of Lake Champlain. We bury it underneath Lake Champlain. We then come out of the southern portion of Lake Champlain and we hop up onto the CP Railroad right-of-way. So this is a pre-disturbed right-of-way that has been around for about 100 years. And we will be burying our 2 cables along the railroad right-of-way. We switch over at the Selkirk Yard around the Capital District region, where we will switch to the CSX right-of-way. Again, this is a pre-disturbed railroad right-of-way. We'll be burying our transmission line along the railroad tracks. We then come down the CSX railroad right-of-way. We go into the Hudson River, almost all the way down to Astoria. We come out of the Hudson River for a very small area, about 7-8 miles in Rockland County. The reason we do that, there's a particularly important fish spawning ground called Havistraw Bay that we're just avoiding that area altogether. So we go on the roadways through Rockland County. which is 9W predominantly, will be bearing our transmission line and that roadway. And then we come down into from the Hudson River, Harlem River, into Astoria, where we interconnect to the Con Ed greater system. As I'd mentioned, we're about a 1,250 megawatt project, and we deliver 10.4 terawatt hours a year. Now, what does that mean to the average user? That's about 1.2 million residential customers a year of electricity. So it's a very significant amount of clean energy that we'll be bringing into the city. And putting in perspective, it represents, the energy represents about 20% of the city's needs. So it's a fairly significant amount of clean energy that we'll be bringing into the city. The project length is 339 miles through New York State. Our partner, Hydro-Quebec, will have to build approximately about a 40-mile line in Quebec to interconnect to us in Lake Champlain. But our portion is about 339 miles. We're looking to start construction this year. So we are looking to start construction in the first half of this year, and we'd be in service by 2025. And the expected life of this project is over 60 years. These projects, cable projects, are built all over the world, and 60 plus years is very common for these types of projects. So this is a very long-term critical piece of infrastructure for New York State. Just to put it in perspective, this project represents about half of the output of what Indian Point used to produce. That's not why we developed this project, but just so happens it's a good metric so people can understand the significance of this project. We're what's called a merchant transmission project, so we actually have to go out and find customers for our line. We did that. We went out and had what's called an open solicitation. Many different producers participated in that process, and Hydro-Quebec was the winner. Hydro-Quebec then bid into what's called the NYSERDA Tier 4 REC program, and we'll talk a little bit more. I have a slide on that just to give you a little more information on that. And they were successful. They won that RFP. So our project, CHPE, is one of the winners in the Tier 4 NYSERDA REC program that's going to bring clean energy into the city. The host communities in New York State will be delivering about 1.7 billion in new tax revenue over the first 30 years of the project life. And that's benefiting 73 different municipalities and 59 different school districts. We have all of our major permits. So the three critical permits you need is the Article 7, which is the New York State siting permit, our presidential permit, which is required because we cross an international border, and the Army Corps of Engineers permits. That's primarily due to the fact that we're in waterways. We have widespread support from environmental unions, businesses, the various host communities that we go through. And just to give you an example of the host community support, 36 municipalities have passed resolutions of support for the project. From an environmental and benefits perspective, it's estimated that we'll decrease carbon by about 3 million metric tons a year. So that's one of the major benefits of this project is the CO2 reduction associated with displacing primarily fossil fuel, which is what we'll be displacing in the city. Harmful pollutants, which is a very, very local phenomena. It's about 20% reduction. Significant economic benefits for New York and New York City and New York State, when we have 1,400 direct jobs associated with this project during the 4 years of construction, and approximately 3,000 secondary jobs that are created because of the primary jobs during the construction period. And again, this is all buried infrastructure. So this is very, very resilient and reliable. And as we think about some of the things that have happened due to climate change recently in terms of effect on the grid in not only New York State, but across the country, you can certainly see the benefit of having two things. One is a fully buried piece of infrastructure, and secondly, having the energy supply being far away from the city in terms of, any storm that's going to affect the city is very unlikely to also affect the supply source up in Quebec. So I had mentioned that Hydro-Quebec was selected as part of the Tier 4 REC program. So this program was driven by New York City's Local Law 97 and New York State CLCPA. Both of these groundbreaking legislations require significant reductions in CO2 and bringing more clean energy into not only the city, but the state. So CLCPA is requiring 70% of all energy that's produced, electricity produced in New York State. 70% will have to be renewable by 2030. And as we sit here in 2022, 8 years away, that's a very daunting task in order to be able to achieve that. So the Public Service Commission of New York and NYSERDA worked together to come up with a plan on how they were going to achieve this. And as you can see the plan here, we have the requirement for 106 terawatt hours, which represents the 70% of the 2030 goal. In order to achieve that 106 terawatt hours, 39 of it is already in place. So that's existing renewables in the state. And that's primarily hydropower upstate New York. You've got onshore wind and solar. And this is a combination of existing onshore wind and solar plus new RFPs that will be coming out by NYSERDA between now and 2030. Offshore wind, there's been a lot of excitement in the offshore wind renewable energy resource over the last number of years. This is an extremely exciting new resource that is going to represent about 26 terawatt hours, or 24% of the requirement of the 2030 goal. And the newest one is the Tier 4 REC projects, which is where we are. So ourselves, CHPE, and also Clean Path New York were chosen by NYSERDA. So we represent about 18.2 terawatt hours, or 17% of the total energy required to get to that 70% goal by 2030. And then there's about a 6.7 or 6.7 terawatt hours, or 6% of the remaining energy. And that will be made up of potentially a combination of Tier 4 projects and offshore wind projects. So NYSERDA has a plan in place in order to achieve this goal. And certainly the two projects, our project and Clean Path New York are a significant portion of achieving that 2030 goal. And again, for New York City, our project alone represents about 20% of the city's needs. And at this point in time, approximately 90% of the electricity produced in New York City is from fossil generation. So, you've really got a situation where downstate is almost exclusively being supplied by thermal fossil generation, and upstate has a much greener grid. And so what NYSERDA needed to do was be able to incent projects like ours to get built so that they could bring that clean energy right into the city. I had mentioned about the reduction in local pollutants, and this is one of the interesting benefits of this project. We're going to be connecting right into Astoria, Queens, and the Astoria complex has historically been an area where mostly thermal generation, fossil generation has been producing electricity for many, many years, but unfortunately it also produces a lot of harmful pollutants, which are very localized and are harmful from a health perspective. So you have NOx, SOx, particulate matter, volatiles that are all produced by these thermal generation or fossil generating facilities. And our project is going to be displacing those dirtier plants causing those local pollutants. And we had our economists look at what's the equivalent of the amount of local pollutants that we'll be displacing. It's equivalent to about 15 out of the 16 peaker plants that are currently parked all over New York City. So this is a significant amount of reduction in very local pollutants, which are health-related issues in these communities. So, this is a very positive attribute of the project from a very local perspective. We've been working very closely with the communities in the design of this project. And a couple of things that we have done is, we're committed to hiring local people whenever that's possible. We're a union construction project, and so we're working with all the different communities to try and get as many local people working in these communities as we possibly can. And to assist that, we have what we call a green economy fund. I'm going to talk a little more on that, but it's a $40 million jobs training fund that's going to ensure access to clean energy jobs training for frontline communities. And on top of that, we also have a $117 million fund for research and improvement projects in the water bodies. And that those funds are being used for Lake Champlain, Hudson River, Harlem River, and East River. So that environmental trust fund is being used to look at all kinds of different studies in these different water bodies. On the Green Economy Fund, as I mentioned, it's a $40 million fund to provide disadvantaged and frontline communities access to job training. It's going to support residents living in these disadvantaged frontline communities by creating good access to good paying jobs with organized labor. It's been developed, and Jen White, who is on the call with me today, has been instrumental in the development of this program. Is developed in close consultation with local workforce development experts, labor unions, housing authorities, and other NGOs. It's going to serve the needs of the communities located along the entire project. So that's all the way from the border right into Astoria, and the Bronx is obviously one of those communities. And we'll be focused to fund relevant proposals from established green jobs training programs and be accessible to residents living in these disadvantaged communities. So we are establishing a board at this point in time, and that board is going to help us guide where these funds are going to be going. And the $40 million is a contribution from both transmission developers, our company who's actually developing the project, and Hydro-Quebec, who is going to be supplying the green power. I'd mentioned about the resiliency, resilient design of this project. Just thinking back to some of the, I guess what would have been called 1 in 100-year events, which now seem to be much more frequent. From Sandy to what happened in California, what happened in New Orleans, what happened here recently in New York once again, in Texas last year in terms of climate change impacting the grid's ability to be able to supply power, blackouts, and having this fully buried, safe, resilient transmission line as part of the broader New York grid, we think it's an incredibly important piece of infrastructure for the state from a resiliency perspective. And the fact that Hydro-Quebec's resource is so far away from New York City, it's just hard to imagine a storm that would ever impact both the load in New York City and the generation in Quebec at the same time. So we feel that those attributes are going to be really important going forward as climate change does impact the grid's ability to be able to respond to these different storms. And even in a circumstance where New York City's grid, if it ever did go down again, one of the really important attributes of this project is the fact that it can actually black start the grid. So what that means is that the grid needs an electric supply to be able to re-kick the grid back on again. And one of the features of the technology that we have chosen between the technology we've chosen for our transmission line and the hydro supply behind it, it can restart that grid. And because of the fact that it is hydropower, it's actually running 24/7, 365 days of the year. So unlike other renewable resources, intermittent renewable resources like wind and solar, which can run somewhere between 25 and 40% of the time, we'll be running effectively 100% of the time. The hydropower standing behind this project is going to supply this project 24/7, 365 days of the year. Just talk a little bit about where the project comes into the city. So on this top slide here, if you can look at On the top slide, we come in from the Hudson River at what we call milepost 324, and we go down the Harlem River. And you can see here, if I just blow this up a little bit, you can see a milepost 325. So this would be going by Community Board 8 between milepost 324 and 325. Down the Harlem River, and on the bottom slide, that continues down. You can see that it continues to go down the Harlem River. And again, the cables themselves will be buried into the bottom of the Harlem River. It comes milepost 328, 329. And then as we come down the Harlem River, we come to milepost 330, and you'll see here two different lines. One is a black line and one is a purple line. So the black line was what we originally permitted back in 2013 with the Public Service Commission. So that was going to go into the Harlem River Yards and then over to the Astoria complex. Our engineering team had a look at this in more detail starting back in 2017. And there has been a lot of development in the Harlem River Yards since we had our project originally permitted, not the least of which was a lot of new underground infrastructure that Con Ed had put in place because of previous storms in New York City. So we revisited that and started to work with New York City, the Parks Department, Department of Transport, and other departments within New York City to look at an alternative. And the alternative that we came up with was to be able to go through Randall's Island. So again, just to be very clear, as we look at milepost 330, we come along this purple line, we transition into the Harlem River Yards for about 1,500 feet. So it's just a short distance in the Harlem River Yards. And again, this is all buried. We then went, this dotted yellow and purple line is what we call a horizontal directional drill. So we actually drill underneath the Harlem River, right underneath Randall's Island. We then come up in sort of the center of Randall's Island. Again, we're still about 6 feet underground. When I say we come up, we're as deep as I think 40 or 50 feet under Randall's Island. We come up to about 6 feet. There's a walkway that will be going underneath. And then we go under that walkway on Randall's Island. And then this yellow and purple line is again another horizontal directional drill where we actually drill underneath the East River over to the Astoria complex where we interconnect to our converter station where we deliver the power to the Con Ed grid. This is a little more detailed engineering drawing about that 1,500 feet I had mentioned through the Harlem River Yards. So this is just a little more detail about where we're going to be putting our different, where the cable is going to be, how much of a right-of-way that we need in order to be able to maintain the cables, where there's vaults, where we transition from going from in water onto land. So this is part of the much more detailed engineering that we had to do with New York City. And New York City, one of the things on Randall's Island that was critically important for the project and for Randall's Island was that we had to make sure that we were not interfering with anything that the park would be doing today or, many, foreseeable years into the future. So there was a lot of redesign on what we originally proposed. I'm proud to say today that, I think everybody is very pleased with the design that we've come up with. And, we're going to be working during the off season. So we're not going to be impacting any of the park's programs during the summer. And it's a relatively brief period of time that we'll be constructing on Randall's Island. And then finally, we come into the Astoria complex. The power that we generate, so because this is cable, we actually have to transmit this power with what's called DC power or direct current in everybody's home where you actually plug your TV or anything into a receptacle. That's all AC power. So we have to convert it from DC to AC. So we actually have to build what's called a converter station. in the Astoria complex. And from that converter station, that AC power is then connected into the Con Ed grid, and then the Con Ed grid distributed throughout the city. With that, we're happy to take questions.
Don, thank you. That was incredibly economical, a lot of information, totally comprehensive at the same time. Thank you very much. So I just had a couple of questions that I'm sure is on everybody's mind, and then I'll open it to the committee and then to the public with us today. So first, we all know that you mentioned about the 70 by 30, okay, milestone. And I think what some people have been wondering is about when NYSERDA starts to issue more RFPs or more request more energy to meet the next milestone towards 2030, right? Will you be able to deliver or reach or participate in that with existing construction that you have existing permits for construction that you will be starting right now? Or so is your installation right now scalable, the transmission lines and any converter station that you have to meet additional energy generation, renewable energy generation goals?
So we've actually scaled our project up once already. So we were originally a 1,000 megawatt project. That was state of the art when we started developing this project. State of the art now is 1,250 megawatts. So we actually scaled it up by 25% about 3 years ago. And so that was the first step. To answer your question directly, we've actually sold 100% of the throughput on our line to NYSERDA. So we cannot scale this up further. The cables themselves cannot be scaled up further. But there's also there's a technical reason why you can't scale it up much more on a single project. Going back to the 60s when the terrible blackouts occurred in the Northeast, the reason that happened was there was not a lot of coordination between the utilities, and therefore there was a terrible blackout that occurred. And subsequent to that, there has been a very tight coordination between all of the different utilities and the different operating areas throughout North America. And what they do is they ensure that no single piece of equipment, if it trips off, can impact the grid like it did back in the 60s during those terrible outages. And so they have what's called the single largest contingency. And the reason they can say that they're comfortable that that single piece of equipment isn't going to take down the grid is they have backup generation standing by to cover that. In New York State, it's about 1,300 megawatts is the single largest contingency. So you really don't want to scale a project much above that threshold.
Could you talk about how this could impact the Hudson and Harlem rivers environmentally? What will community members see when you do construction? What did you have to do to ensure no harm is being done to the rivers? And how will the community actually see what's going on? Will the community see what's going on out their windows, out the Hudson and Harlem rivers?
Sure. So let me talk first a little bit about the permitting side. Do no harm to the areas that we're putting our project in. So we had to go through 3 very rigorous permitting processes. First is the Article 7, which is the main siting permit for the state of New York, and all of the environmental concerns. As an example, Riverkeeper was one of the parties who was in our docket helping to design the project. So we had to be able to demonstrate that we were not impacting the waterways and the land routes that we were going through. We had to study, whether that's sturgeon in the Hudson River and the Harlem River, whether that's upland, things like endangered species like Carner blue butterflies or certain bats, all of our different techniques as to how we are actually going to be installing the cables. That had to be very carefully designed so that in the end that it's not going to be doing any environmental harm to the areas that we're going to be traversing. So extensive studies. There are many different studies in terms of looking at alternatives. So we had to do extensive alternative analysis as well, and the consensus amongst all of the state and federal agencies is that the project that we have designed meets and exceeds all the criteria that they have. What we originally came into the process with is different in terms of what our project looked like originally compared to what our final project looks like right now. In terms of constituents, actually, community members being able to see our construction, you will actually be able to see the construction. So there will be barges, specially built barges that will be coming down the Hudson River that will be laying the cable on the bottom, and they'll come down the Harlem River as well. And then, so you'll be able to see those barges as they're coming down the waterways, installing the actual physical cable. It's fairly quick in waterways for installing the cables, and certainly Kun Lee, who's on, he's one of our lead engineers who's on this call as well. He can give you more detail, but we have some very good videos showing how the actual cables will be installed, and pictures of the different barges that we'll be constructing.
Thanks, that'd be helpful. I had just a suggestion, because the Hudson River has had so many long-standing environmental cleanup efforts having to navigate the problem of disturbing sediments, some of which are pollutants. And you understand when you're actually doing your riverbed construction, you could actually be churning up some sediments that are now out of the water system. Will you have continual monitoring, and perhaps as you're upstate to start, you'll see how this changes that could occur by the time you get here. Will you have water quality monitoring alongside your construction? Because I could definitely see that churning of sedimented pollutants affecting our, you heard before, very sensitive water quality consent decree that we're under here in New York City.
Absolutely. So as part of our Article 7, it's really is the most comprehensive in terms of all of the conditions that New York State has put on the project in terms of the construction techniques, water quality monitoring, real-time water quality monitoring, having a quality monitoring person on board who is going to be responsible to ensure that we do not exceed all of the criteria that's been established in our Article 7. So that, the sediment and the real-time information is going to be displayed on the barges, and we're allowed to have so much what's called turbidity, which is just the amount of sediment that's in the waterway. If you exceed that, there are many different ways you can lower that down, but the easiest one is you just slow down. You just slow down the barge, you just slow down the process, and the turbidity goes down. But that's a long way of saying, yes, we're going to be doing real-time monitoring, and yes, PSC is going to have, we'll be hiring them, but they'll have a monitoring person who will report to the Public Service Commission.
Don, thanks, it's excellent. Any questions from the committee for Mr. Jessen? All right, yes. David, just let me check, make sure no one from the committee, and then I'll get to you. And then to Marie Claude. I see two hands right now. So David, go ahead, thanks.
Yes, Tom, Don, excuse me. As you can see, we truly are on the river. So I think we'd be very anxious to know exactly when your cable laying ships will be here. I had the pleasure of seeing the massive left coast lifter, which is about a 15-story crane, float down the Hudson when they were replacing the base of the turntable bridge at the Spuyten Duyvil. So it was fascinating. But anyway, I do have two questions for you. I gather that the hydro is, spinning turbines. But up there at Champlain, I don't think there are any waterfalls or any major rivers dumping into the into Lake Champlain. So what exactly is the hydropower?
So Hydro-Quebec, as I had mentioned, we're about 1,250 megawatts of capacity. Hydro-Quebec they have 40,000 megawatts of existing hydropower, and they have an additional 5,000 megawatts of hydropower that they have contracted in a neighboring province. So they have under their control about 45,000 megawatts of hydro. Well, it's actually hydro. They have about 5,000 megawatts of wind in there as well. So this is all existing hydropower that's connected into the Quebec grid. So, you're going far north of Montreal, literally 1,000 miles north of Montreal is where a lot of this hydro generation exists today. It's then interconnected into the Hydro-Quebec grid. And we connect in our transmission line connects to Hydro-Quebec at the border, and for about 40 miles, they'll run cables up Lake Champlain, up to a substation called Hertel, where Hertel is connected into the broader grid. So once you plug into the grid in Hydro-Quebec, you have access to that full 45,000 megawatts of hydropower.
So you're largely just tapping their excess.
We are 100% tapping their excess. That's exactly what we're doing.
That's truly amazing. My other question is, as we all know, with all the GE PCB issues in the North Hudson, there was a big debate about, dig it up or just cap it. And, along the lines of Bob's question, what are you going to be doing in those areas? Are you going to be laying cable on top of the cap or what?
So what we did is we said, no good answer. And so we just avoided it. So if you actually look at, so we were looking at, and particularly the GE cleanup area on the PCBs. And, we got, very early on, we realized that was just going to be so difficult to try to navigate. We said, let's just avoid it altogether. And that's why we went, for a lot of reasons, we went on the railroad rights of way instead.
I see.
Thank you.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Member of our committee, Karen, go ahead. Karen, unmute yourself.
Okay, how deep are you going in the Hudson? And then when you make the turn, how deep are you going in the Harlem? And are you going down the middle of the Harlem? Are you going down close to near the edge? That's the question.
So it's, I'll say approximately 6 feet is the burial depth. The reason I say approximate is because there are some areas where we can be a little bit shallower. There's some areas where we have to be deeper, but on average, it's about 6 feet. There's a lot of reasons why 6 feet is important, not the least of which that's a good burial depth to make sure that if a ship ever lost steerage and had to drop anchor, the chances of them snagging our cable at a 6 foot burial depth is dramatically reduced. And so that's why the 6 foot burial depth is really important.
So how much what's the difference between the Hudson and the Harlem?
In terms of,
I understand that you're going 6 feet underneath the highest point, but how deep are you going in the Hudson? And then how deep are you going in the Harlem?
They're both about the same. They're both about 6 feet from the bottom. When I say 6 feet, I'm talking from the bottom of the riverbed, 6 feet below that.
Right, but the Hudson is much deeper than the Harlem. So what are you going to do when you get to that turn?
So we'll just be on the, so we physically lay the cables on the bottom, and then we bury them 6 feet below the bottom of the riverbed. So we'll be on the riverbed, and then we physically bury it 6 feet below that.
Okay.
So
How are you
tracing the
burying?
floor of the river.
How are you burying them? Are you blasting?
No, we use what's called a jet plow. So a jet plow is, and we've got a video that can show how that actually works. So what happens is the cable is laid on the bottom. So that's what happened first. The cable gets laid on the bottom. And then the construction company comes back with a piece of equipment that sits on top of the cables, and it physically pushes water down into the riverbed. That raises the sediment about a couple of feet. The cable goes down, sinks into the bottom, and then the sediment falls back on top of it.
Okay.
We have a video that shows that. And your other question with respect to where are we in the Hudson and Harlem rivers, I would say we're the easiest thing is for us to send you maps, because it's just too difficult to say exactly where it is, because there's different areas. We're in different spots in the Hudson River, different areas we're in the Harlem River. Harlem River, you could say pretty much right down the center, but you know, we'll get you, if you're interested, we'll send you the exact maps that shows you exactly where we're planning on putting the cables.
Yes, of
Yes,
course.
that
we'd
would
love
be
that.
helpful. And also the exact depth. I mean, it's 6 feet underneath this part of the river, but two rivers not the same height. Bottom is not the same.
Yeah, we will. We actually have what's called a viewer system, which actually shows you, you know, sort of like line by like area by area, exactly where the cable is, what the depth is. You know, you could see the whole thing, or we could send you maps, whichever is most convenient for you guys. We'd have, if we were going to do the viewer, we would have to do another Zoom call. It's just it's one of our contractors has that as one of our tools.
Well understood. Please send the maps, of course, the
Mhm.
PowerPoint, and those videos of how this is
Right.
installed, the plow. That would be fabulous.
Thank
I'd
you.
like to recognize Jody Colon, who's an important stakeholder and community leader in the Spuyten Duyvil community. You will be right on her front door.
We
Well,
will.
thank you. Marie Claude was actually ahead of me, and since she is quite involved in the community as well, would you like her to go first?
You are deferring things. Marie Claude, why don't you go? My apologies, Marie Claude.
Well, Jody, thank you. I think you are, but anyway. Here are some of my questions. I have a few. Number one, how are the cables insulated? Is it like plastic, metal tubes? And related to that question is, how are they guaranteed for 60 years? How do you monitor the state of those cables? So the material that encapsulates them, and how do you monitor them?
Thank you, Marie Claude.
So these are representations. I give them out to anybody who needs a mouse pads, but these are representations of this is the physical size of the cable. So to answer your question, so right here, this part here is copper. So this is where the electricity actually flows. This part here is what's called cross-linked polyethylene. So this is the actual insulation piece of the cable. If you have like a typical white cutting board, it's very similar to material as to that cutting board material. And actually, if you go to the plant, the little beads that they melt to create the insulation, it's a very similar process. I know that this is actually a submarine cable. We have both submarine and land cable. This is steel on the outer portion here. This is to protect the cable. And then this here is also steel reinforcement for submarine cable. If this was land cable, you wouldn't have this last layer of protection. So electricity flows here. It's insulated from the environment through this piece. And then this third piece here, this is mechanical protection for the cable.
All right, so this is like a 60-year warranty?
Yeah, what is the lifespan for the cable?
So the cables themselves, I know we're in the middle of negotiations right now. They probably don't have a 60-year warranty on them. That, you know, it's probably a 20 or 25-year warranty, which is fairly typical in the industry. But the actual cables themselves have been manufactured all over the world. Like there's literally hundreds of these projects all over the world. And, you know, if you look at the life cycle of these projects, which our engineering team has done extensively, you know, 50, 60, 70, 80 years of life is very typical. The reason that we're confident on that is because there's no moving parts in these cables. The cables are inert. It's not like a mechanical piece of equipment that wears out. This is an electrical piece of equipment that can literally run forever. Now, nothing runs forever. So how do we know that the cables, and I think that was the second half of your question, is how do we monitor the cables? Because, you know, they're going to be buried, they're going to be underground. Interestingly enough, both converter stations, so there will be one in Quebec and there'll be one in Astoria in New York. They actually are constantly monitoring all sorts of parameters on the cables. And one of the ways they do that, there's actually a fiber optic cable that runs alongside the two power cables. It's used for many things. A lot of it is communications between the converter stations, so they're constantly talking to one another in order to make sure that you know, the power flows are being done properly. But it also monitors heat. So it monitors the heat associated with the cables. So because they're an electrical piece of equipment, they give off heat, and you can actually monitor that with these fiber optic cables. And that tells you if there's any hotspots on the cable. And if you determine that there's a hotspot on the cable, you have to go out and find out why there's a hotspot in the cable. So it's a monitoring system to tell you how the cables are performing.
And
Thank
you are, or there's who would be going down there to check the cables?
So we have a what we call an engineering, procurement, and construction. We have 3 companies actually, but the manufacturer of our cables is a company called NKT. And the company that will actually be installing it is a company called Caldwell Marine. Caldwell Marine has been installing cables in the Northeast for, I don't know, 50 plus years. So if we were to have any problems on the cable, we actually we will be setting up what we call cable splicing areas throughout the state. And so they will have cable splices available in warehouses in strategic locations along the state, so that if anyone had to go back and dig up the cables, it would be Caldwell Marine. We'll have them under contract to be on standby, and they will have these cable splices ready to be put into the field very quickly.
Thank you.
Jody, if I can ask another question?
No, I'd like to move to someone else. We're
Okay,
running late.
that's
Thank you.
fine.
You can write that in an email. Thank you. Jody, and then Deb Travis is our last question. Jody, go ahead.
Okay, I actually have a bunch of them, so I'll prioritize. My first one is that the Harlem River is a rat's nest of cables that have shifted, used to be submerged or not submerged, and also is silt on top of rock. So can you talk to me a little bit about how you are going to hydroplow through rock and through all these other cables? Have you done a survey of them yet?
So we have done I'll say yes, we've done a survey, but we need to do, we'll be actually putting physical divers into the water. And you're absolutely right. When we get an obstacle such as rock, what we do is we lay the cables on the bottom, and then we put what's called articulating mats on top of them. These mats are concrete mats that were designed by the Army Corps of Engineers for cable installations. So you lay the cables on that hard surface, and then you put these mats on top of them. But you're spot on. We'll be doing, so we've done side scan sonar maps so far. So they would tell you they can penetrate maybe a foot into the ground. It's the magnetic field that can penetrate about a foot into the ground, and you can get pretty detailed maps from that. But we will then be doing additional work, which will include actually putting divers on the bottom, because we'll be having to map out every one of the locations of cables, where there's obstacles. So we need to do that well in advance of when we're going to be actually installing the cable. It's probably at least a year ahead of when we'd be installing the cable. I know they're finalizing all those schedules right now, but that's how you make sure that if there's any obstacles, you can move the obstacles too. That's the other thing that you can do.
Okay, and then my, as Bob alluded to, I will see this out my window. And, so I'm glad to hear that no wetlands are being disrupted, because you said it's
No.
past environmental muster.
Yeah.
And hang on, let me check your permit for a second, but does this hydroplow create wakes? I know turbidity is one thing, but wakes are another thing. There are some very narrow parts of the Harlem River, especially where the Hudson and you make that turn.
Yeah. Probably the best person to talk about that. If Kunle can jump in, he might have a better idea.
Yeah, Don, this is Kunle. I think it's going to be, the plow is going to be controlled. It's going to be under the control of the installation team. So they will be able to monitor their plowing speed to make sure there is very minimal wake as they go forward. That machine can be controlled to make sure that they're installing at the rate that they need and make the turn at the same time. So the real answer is it's controllable and it's going to be managed to minimize any potential wake in the water.
Okay, that's great, because there are a lot of wetlands in the Harlem as you turn from the Hudson up through about Marble Hill. So from Spuyten Duyvil to Marble Hill, there are some wetlands that get very severely impacted by wakes. And then my last thing is just a clarification. You mentioned a lot about the benefits being displacing fossil fuel plants. Are their plants shutting down? I mean, it just sounds to me like you're counting environmental benefits about offsetting fossil fuel, but with all of the increased development that's happening in Manhattan and even in our community, and with the potential redevelopment of the Penn Station area with 1,700 foot tall buildings, it just seems like no fossil fuel plants are shutting down, and you're just going to be additional megawatts for the additional needs for a growing New York City that's planning to add a million more people in the next few years. So can you explain that for me?
Yeah, so great question. I think a couple of things are happening here. One is, of course, there is a tremendous amount of energy efficiency going on in the city. So the city is trying to reduce its actual demand, even while growth is occurring in the number of people coming into the city. So the energy efficiency programs are really going to be driving down the actual usage per person in the city itself. So when we say we're going to be displacing thermal generation, when we come on in 2025, 20% of the city's electricity will be produced by our project. And that is, today, it's almost 100% being produced by thermal. So for sure, in the first 10, 15, 20 years, there's going to be a significant reduction in the amount of thermal generation. And under CLCPA, under the state law and local law 97, the amount of clean energy has to continue to increase to get us to 70% by 2030, taking into account any growth that occurs. So even if there is growth, the amount of clean energy coming in has to still be 70% of the state's requirement. So the state is, by 2040, it's 100% renewable energy. So thermal generation is truly coming off the system. It has to come off the system. It's by law has to come off the system.
Yeah, we have a lot of laws, and it's not reassuring that you're saying Riverkeeper and the PSC because they tried to ram something through Spuyten Duyvil with the Empire connection, which is still on the books, and that turned out to be very bad for the river, very bad for New York City. So,
Thank you, Jody, for the
I will be
question.
watching.
Well,
Thank you.
Had
again, okay.
This has been an area of interest for a lot of Bronxites about growing the pie versus a sunset schedule for especially peakers. Doesn't impact this district, but it reflects Jody's interest. So yeah, we see there's a market shift being incentivized with the law and with the investment rather than sunset clauses in the law. Deb, you have our last comment, our last question. Thank you.
Two. One is just about the height of the barge as it's going, and will it impact the bridges on Harlem? Would we expect the Broadway Bridge, which I know is a pivot bridge, would be closed to traffic for some period of time? And the other one is just really EMFs. There's a health impacts that are attributed to these high frequency power. So just to kind of close on that and how you've been mitigating for that.
Yep. So Cooley, do you want to take the first one and I'll take the second one?
Yeah, we're going to be working around the bridges, and our progress rate is going to reflect, it's going to be coordinated by the contractor with necessary permits to be able to go under the bridge in those locations. So the contractor is basically doing their work plan right now. So by the time we get ready to go to construction, we'll have a plan that's coordinated with all the bridge infrastructure owners in terms of crossing height and where we're going to be at what time. The other point I wanted to notice is that, the communities are going to be notified, the mariners are going to be notified. We're going to be working way ahead of time to make sure that the communities around the area we're working have well enough notice about when the work's going to happen around their communities.
So I want to thank you for the answer and thank you for the question. Deb, did that cover both you had?
It was
No,
the first one.
Yeah,
First one?
I can take the EMF portion of it.
Sorry about that. Go ahead. Yep.
Yeah, no worries. So with respect to EMF, so we are below all of state and federal standards, and that was studied extensively in terms of making sure that we were below all of the standards, and it was studied, in terms of making sure that things like, there are certain fish like sturgeon who actually use magnetic fields to find direction, find food. All of that was studied extensively to make sure that our project will not impact it. But just a little more fine point on this, a couple of interesting things. So this is DC power. So the magnetic field that we actually produce with this project, it's extremely attenuated because of the fact that it's buried at 6 feet below ground, but it's also lower than the magnetic field of the Earth's own magnetic field. So our actual field is lower than what's the Earth itself produces that points our compass. The other point I would make is most of the concern around magnetic fields is actually AC magnetic fields. And the reason there is a concern around AC magnetic fields is just because DC, it can't actually be induced on a nearby piece of metallic surface because of the properties, because it's a DC magnetic field. An AC magnetic field actually can be induced on a nearby metallic surface. And that's why there is more concern about AC than DC. There's lots of ways you can also shield AC magnetic fields. So there's lots of rules around that as well, but it's just a differentiator between the AC and the DC systems.
Well, now I get to say thank you, Don and Jen and Ayakuni. You really came prepared for everything, and we're really impressed by your grasp of the whole. You also helped us visualize this and what it will look like at our front doors. So we thank you. We look forward to the PowerPoint and any of the videos that show the plowing, which would be great, as well as maps.
Yep.
And thank you for your patience in hearing about our stormwater plans, new stormwater rules in the city of New York. Another big project coming to us. So thanks very much. And it's a pleasure to have you here today.
And
Thank you so much for having us.
Itinerary of your ships in the neighborhood.
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks
Great.
for having us.
Great presentation. Thank you very much. Very thorough. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Great. Now I want to congratulate Debbie, Myra, who do we have? Julia, anyone else from the Skyview community who has stuck it out. And I want to thank you for keeping the issue of the Ludlow plant on our front burner. I also want to thank Assemblyman Jeffrey Dinowitz's office and his policy specialist, Frederick Klein, who's going to be speaking to us about the follow-up that we've taken to respond to Skyview complaints. And Effie is here, yes. So Effie is familiar with odor complaints that have been issued by Bronx residents from Skyview residents who have faced some downwind odor issues coming from the Ludlow plant, right? And they've been in front of this committee at least twice before, and we've pursued some odor tests, air pollution tests. And I wanted to report before we start talking about next step about what we've done since you last came to us in December. So there are legislators in Yonkers that are actively involved in trying to procure federal funds to improve the performance of this filtration plant. And as I said in an email to the group, Skyview residents should be contacting the office of these elected officials, okay, and issuing and joining complaints. They have held joint press conferences to try to elicit and gain federal funds to increase the performance and odor control for the Ludlow plant. Okay, so Congressman Bowman, who was the liaison to the Biden administration and its funds. Okay, County Legislator Jose Alvarado and County Executive Latimer are all joining forces in trying to lobby for more federal funds. It would be crucial, okay, if they were to hear from Riverdale residents, Bronx residents, that there is an extra constituency that is impacted by odor. Okay, so and I think it would be a great thing. I will be happy to put this in writing to the chair of the board as well of Skyview. I've been in touch with Mr. Shortell and propose that anyone in the Skyview community or North Riverdale community who is impacted by this smell, call these legislatures to document your impacts. Okay, that's number one. Number two, so getting on board with the legislators and their advocacy. There is also a Westchester odor control complaint. And this is a wonderful opportunity to flood. It's just like 311 for us here in the city. And it's a wonderful opportunity to flood the county office with more complaints. The more complaints they get, the more desperate they will get to remediate this. And then we get into the area of permitting from DEC. So those were two big steps I wanted to suggest. Then we get in the issue of permitting, and I'm going to ask Frederick to talk a little bit about the conversations. I want to thank Karen Argenti also for contributing ideas about how to reach out to the state. This is a state permitted pollution control facility. Okay, and Frederick, just go ahead and talk about what you've learned so far about what DEC is allowed to do with this plant so far and what they could do.
Sure. So we reached out to the DEC after Bob contacted us to sort of share your concerns about the odor at Skyview. So the DEC, they have a permit that they issue for basically this plant to operate. They review 10% of their statewide permits each year based on certain criteria that we didn't get into. But this permit was not in that 10% group last year, so it hasn't come up for a full review. So we would like to request that it gets reviewed by DEC. And then additionally, the DEC did confirm that there's not currently any odor control terms in the existing permit for this plant. But that they did say that the plant has voluntarily added odor control elements to most of their processing equipment. So most, not meaning all, but so those are two things that we would like to focus on with DEC is one, please review this permit. And then two, please add specific and frankly strong odor control terms to the permit that are, similar and commensurate with what all the other plants in the metropolitan area have. So that's where we are at. I'm also happy to hear from some of you about maybe add a little color and add a little sort of emotion to the issue. These things can come off kind of dry in a letter. So I'm happy to hear from all of you as well.
I want to also share, Frederick, I found a permit. I forgot to attach it to you, but this is a DEC permit. I'll show you what it looks like here. This is for air pollution. And this is expired. Okay. And joint what provides primary and secondary Westchester. Okay. Is this the Ludlow? Is this the same one?
Yes.
Yes, Ludlow Dock. Yes. Okay. Provides primary and secondary treatment of wastewater. Okay. I want to go to page 8, and everybody, I will, Myra, I will send this to you, okay, to take a look at.
Okay.
It does look like there is an expired permit here as of 2019. It's here on this page. So this is air pollution control Title V permit. And I guess I think committee members, I want to support everything and thank everything that Assemblyman Dinowitz and Frederick are doing. Do you want the committee also to write a letter asking for similar things on behalf of the community? Do you want to let Frederick's office handle it?
May I speak, Bob?
Go ahead, Myra, go ahead, yeah.
No, I just wanted to remind you, unfortunately, Pamela Clivert is not at the meeting, and I assume since she always comes that she is not feeling well. But I just want to remind you what she said when she first, became involved with the Ludlow plant, that, she visited it there, she met with whoever's in charge of that plant, also people who lived in the Ludlow area who also complained. The problem is the plant needs to be upgraded, and they refuse to do it. They deny that there are any fumes coming out of the plant. They come and they investigate, they take tests, and of course, you can never predict when that's going to happen. So if we're looking for, to put in rules and regulations, that helps, but actually doing the work is another story.
So Frederick, is it my understanding that this merits a renewal and not a review? Is that what you're learning from DEC?
Yeah, I'm not, I'm just to be sort of transparent about it, I'm not a permitting process expert, but my understanding is that they do distinguish between a renewal and a review. So they said that there was renewed, it was an EPA major facility. In 2018, the department received a timely renewal application from the permittee, and it was granted, and they were granted a State Administrative Procedures Act extension. So that's what they specifically told me. All I hear from that is that they were most recently permitted in 2018, and that they have a sort of criteria. And then the second part is the current environmental benefit permit strategy score for the facility is 90, and it is not within the top 10% of permits on the 2021 list. So my takeaway from that is that they only really review a certain number of their facilities, and that's where we would like to nudge them. And Ms. Fassner, to your point, like, yeah, we do want to see change. Like, we don't want to just see numbers on a regulation change. We want to see the odor stop and the plant operator to have to step up. So I think my hope and my thought process on this is that by sort of nudging the regulatory agency to up their standards, it will encourage and sort of require the plant operator to also make the change.
Just as a note, we were already complaining in 2018.
Well, that's good to know. So I would honestly appreciate, it would be a good thing to reference for how long these issues have been arising. I would imagine for a while. How regularly they occur. Is it just when the wind is coming south, or is it all times like that? Those are the types of details I would personally appreciate.
Well, I couldn't, nobody can tell you which direction. You just don't know.
Right. So
And,
it's
and,
some days,
so-
not other days.
Yeah, and sometimes it's a totally different smell. Once I thought we just did a lot of planting and put in fertilizer. I realized, oh, it's not fertilizer. It's really very difficult to say. And sometimes it's not always human waste. Sometimes it's some sort of a chemical smell. And it's maddening. First time I smelled it, I thought it was gas. There was a gas leak somewhere. So it's
Thanks, Myra. Karen, you had a hand.
Yeah, I don't know, I didn't read this permit, but generally these speedy permits are 5 years and they
Yeah.
have to be renewed
That's what this was.
every 5 years. And sometimes there's a clause, and I don't know where you have to, like, somebody's gonna have to check that that you could require a public hearing on a permit that's coming before the agency. And in that case, then you can make a lot of trouble concerning this permit. So you should take a look at that also, Frederick. I don't know exactly where it
It's
is
a
in the
good one.
permit.
Yeah.
Also,
So,
could I say something? It's Effie from
please, Effie.
DP.
Yes, yes. Thank
This,
you.
obviously, yeah, no problem. Westchester County obviously does not fall, it's not regulated by the New York City rules that we have at DP. But I can say that when we get plant odor complaints, because we do get them sometimes, there is a protocol in place. So if you were to call 311 and place a plant odor complaint against Hunts Point, for example, in the Bronx,
Right.
immediately our personnel at that plant gets the complaint. And what they do when they get that is they do a walkthrough throughout the entire plant to see which way is the wind blowing that way. Is there something that they're picking up odors from the person who's actually doing the walking around the plant? Are they experiencing any odors or anything like that? Is something malfunctioning that may be causing the odors? But they have like a form that they fill out of, like, all these different things that they're looking into to make sure, is this odor actually coming from the plant or is it coming from somewhere else? So if you do call the Westchester County's 311, what happens to that complaint?
excuse me, this has been done.
Oh, I understand, but who's following up on those complaints?
They-
Does the plant get back to the complainant with some
They don't
information?
follow up. They deny it.
So the elected officials, I think, would be a good route to take and have their offices reach out to them,
So, Myra, just to be clear, you've issued complaints on the Westchester odor control
Not me,
website?
Pamela. I don't know
Yeah.
exactly,
So-
but actually she went there with groups and made complaints.
No, not to the plant, to the county
Yeah.
office.
I
That's
don't
the
know.
complaint.
I don't know.
Yeah, so I think we need, like we always say, call 311 here. We need to have a Skyview campaign or North Riverdale campaign, awareness campaign about calling or using this site, which of course I can't find because the sharing is in the way, but it's easy to find. Just Google Westchester odor control. And I will
Okay.
send that link out to Mr. Shortell, Joe, and have them distribute it to the Skyview community. But I can't stress enough about calling the elected officials office and joining your name to those who are impacted
Will
by
do.
this environmental hazard. There are two other hands up. Who were they? Okay, maybe that was from a previous conversation. Julia, go ahead, Julia. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Hi, thank you.
It's good
I
to
was
see
just
you.
wondering, good to see you. I was just wondering in terms of, calling 311 here in the Bronx. I understand obviously that the water treatment center is not located in New York City. But doesn't New York City have,
No.
the obligation to
No.
put up some kind of, like odor, I don't know, machine, right? To see, for example, in Skyview, right? If there are smells, So I don't know, Effie or, Mr. Klein, if you have some information or can get some information, about that. It seems like, Ms. Fassner's already tried to, explore that. So maybe that's not possible, but I would think as Bronx residents, right, our health and our safety would be, important to the
Now,
city.
excuse me, we've made many complaints to 311, and as soon as they hear it's coming from Westchester, they're done.
There is
They
no
offer- what-
reason, right, there is no reason why we have elected officials, right, that also are part of that area in Westchester. These elected officials can definitely look into, what is going on there, who's responsible for respond. Do they have a public works office that can get involved and or is that the plant directly? Here in the city, it's a whole different scenario of who you can contact when you have a complaint. But you do have your congressional representative who also has that part of Yonkers, right? It's the same, right? So why not contact them? How about your state representative? Isn't that person also part of that district in Yonkers? It makes sense to reach out to them and ask them, what is the protocol? We're getting a lot of complaints from this plant. And what is the protocol? What do they do when they get these complaints? Who's following up on them?
We can definitely try to check in with our counterparts in Yonkers to find out the protocol in Westchester.
Yeah. Mhm.
I would also say, and I'm not obviously speaking for any city agency here, when we get other air quality sort of odor complaints, generally the direction we're pointed in is to you can do your own air quality testing. I know that's not something people want to hear, but from the perspective of if New York City comes out and has equipment to monitor the air quality, they have no enforcement capacity. So it's a little circular, and I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of it, but like in general, city agencies don't like to expend public resources on things that aren't in their jurisdiction. So it seems like an uphill battle, but we can certainly check in. I think it's Assemblymember Pretlow, and I think it's State Senator Stuart Cousins. I'd have to double check those. We can certainly check in with their offices to figure out how these issues are normally addressed through the county government.
One more comment.
Mr. Wong, if you would forward this to Senator DiBiase as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I also just wanted to say, Mr. Klein, Skyview's happy to, give you stories. You were asking earlier for, anecdotes and stories, emotion, right? Which we definitely have, within our community, unfortunately, of people becoming very sick. Not myself. So I'm speaking sort of on behalf of some of my neighbors. So we'd be very happy to coordinate with your office to get you.
Yeah, just to be honest, I didn't know that this was an issue of concern until Bob brought it to our attention. I think, Skyview is not normally shy about sharing issues that they have. So I would definitely like to see that information.
Yeah, and then as Ms. Kessler was saying, this goes back to, Congressman Engel raised this in 2018 and going back probably,
That's probably why we didn't hear about it, because Congressman Engel was on it. But
we had worked, Frederick, extensively with the congressman's office in trying to intercede with. We actually had his staff go to the site as well, and they did redirect traffic. They were actually sending pollutant-laden trucks through our district. And that his office was able to stop that. I also wanted to state that many Skyview residents have called DEP air particulate matter to find contaminants in the air, and of course it's very difficult. And by the time, so DEP was called in at our invitation and instruction, and could not document dangerous levels of air pollutants, but it's different. It's a different animal we're trying to track down here.
Can I ask the management, who operates this plant? Is it the county of Westchester, or do they have a private contractor? Like, what's the actual entity that is?
I'm gonna say, let me look at my permit here. I'm gonna
Yonkers.
The city of
Yonkers.
Yonkers. But is it like a private contractor that they use, or I can do that research too. I just didn't know if somebody's already done it.
The permit is issued to Westchester County.
I'm sorry, I just texted Bob the thing I had looked up for you, Myra, 2 meetings ago. It's the Westchester odor complaint online thing. And I think Karen had emailed that to you.
Yeah,
and
I emailed it to them. Yep, they had that.
And I just found a Ludlow form where you can register to be on a notification list when they are expecting increased odors. So that might be something to join. So you'll get an alert and then you could forward that alert to whoever's gonna try to help you with this. But you know, being a power user of 311, I'll suggest that just repeat what Bob said, is get everybody that you know to fill out the complaint thing. When you get that alert that the odors are expected, just make a phone chain and have everybody fill out that complaint form, because
Absolutely.
the volume makes a big difference. Right now, it's a few people, but if you get 20 people, maybe that will help you in some way. So
Well, that's up to Julia and the board. We don't have the facility to be able to reach all those people. We have 5,000 people here, but nobody
I'm
knows.
gonna put
it's
this
just
in
word of
writing. And,
mouth.
yeah,
The way we do it in my building is I tell two people, they tell two people. You know, like, it doesn't have to be very complex.
But it is 5,000 people and 1,300 apartments and 3 buildings. It's a little different.
You only need 20 calls.
I think this is something we can handle very easily. So Myra, I'm going to follow through on my side to the board, and they'll be able to distribute that advisory about your resources and opportunities. And it's really important that Skyview
That's
residents
great.
reach out to all those elected officials. Frederick, we will continue. We will keep in touch with you. And I have a feeling we'd like to piggyback on your letter after it's issued in agreement and in support. So our committee will probably write our own to DEC, but supporting your efforts and kind of adding a couple more information that we might along the way. And then I just want to say that we won't, if I will put this on the agenda only if there's new news, but that is our plan right now, Myra, okay?
Okay.
And we will check back in with, I will check back in with you personally to find out how the outreach is going within the Skyview community. Full disclosure, I live here at Skyview, so I'm in a position to help that along here. So thanks for that discussion and for bringing it back. I think we really moved the needle, so to speak, quite a bit. I am going to move to, I'm going to lay over the discussion of flood budget planning to next meeting. And is there any further business aside from the business that I'm laying over? Is there a motion to adjourn? It's too late.
I
everybody.
move we adjourn.
Me too. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Thank you all. Great to see you. We really laid it on you tonight. You learned a ton, and thanks for your patience.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks,
thank you.
everyone.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
so much.
Thank you.
Night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.